Scientific Sucrose will blow up her enemies. Today, I'm gonna tell you how to build her best. My name is Juice, and let's get into it. So what artifacts does this sweet scientist desire? None other than 4-piece Viridescent Venerer. There's not really any particular reason to choose anything else for this character. She will oftentimes be the only Animo played in a team, and because her main role focuses on EM sharing, you will most likely be playing with reactable elements. Therefore, this becomes her best supportive pick. 2-piece mix and match sets include 2-piece EM and Animo percent. As for Sucrose's main stats, simple. Go for EM, EM, EM. You actually don't want to bother with ER, and I'll tell you why now. Her burst will oftentimes anti-group, making it clunky and annoying to use in AoE situations. The elemental absorption is also extremely inconsistent in any team outside of Nihilus Aggravate, meaning that even if you have her C6, it's generally not worth using her burst at all. Instead, focus on getting as much EM as humanly possible with her, or I suppose as foxly possible in this particular case. So just dump her with EM, and that'll get the job done just fine. As for stack goals, simple. Literally just get as much EM as humanly possible. Her A4's 20% EM share has no cap on it, so shoot for the stars. 800 is fine if you're using a non-EM weapon like R5 TDDS, and 1000 plus EM is what you should be going for if you're using an EM weapon, along with triple EM on her substats. Remember that ER is not actually all that important on her, as her burst causes issues as opposed to providing benefits. Every great scientist needs the correct apparatus to get the job done. What'll Sucrose's equipment of choice be? None other than R5 TDDS. If you're playing her in a team with an attack scaling main DPS, this is a super easy way to buff him up even further. In such a case, I actually consider this to be your best in slot, even if you end up missing out on EM. Definitely one of her most viable choices. However, her second best in slot will be Sunny Morning Sleep-In. She can completely utilize the entire passive, giving her a crud ton of EM in total. If you're a huge Sucrose fan and want the absolute best for the Science Fox, then this weapon is a great investment for her, not needed by any means of course. Sacrificial Fragments offers her another skill cast, which means more swirls, not to mention the lovely amount of EM that it provides. If you're really trying to double down on building EM on this character, then this is certainly the way to go. 1000 Floating Dreams can work on her, seeing as it has universal team-wide benefits, and it provides a lot of EM. The damage bonus is kind of useless for Sucrose because her personal damage comes from swirls, which are transformative reactions. Those don't give a flying hoot about damage bonus percent buffs, but all of the EM-related buffs? Absolutely welcomed. Starcaller's Watch is another great stat stick. The second half of the passive doesn't matter for Sucrose anyways, so it's fine that she can't activate it. We're mostly here for the free 365 EM, combined from both its weapon's main stat and the passive at R1. Great stuff. Mappa Mare works too, and it's craftable, but I truly don't know why you would choose this over TDDS, which is also free, while being infinitely more effective. Same logic applies to Magic Guide. I don't like recommending Prototype Amber, because you really want to avoid bursting with Sucrose if you can, but if you really need the additional healing, and you have no other way of getting it, then fine, this option is here. Just know what you're getting into when you equip this on her. Generally, you go for either the supportive one, or the one that dumps her with the most EM. It's genuinely as simple as that. Yet who shall assist in Sucrose's experiments? Well, driver teams are comps in which Sucrose is the on-fielder currently proccing swirls, and sharing her EM throughout the team. This archetype is pretty strong for her when you're pairing her up with a lot of procs-based characters, or units who do all of her damage off-field such as Fischl or C0-5 Lady Farina. She's an excellent Animo driver, and no Inazuma standard 5-star could hope to compare. Example teams include Sucrose, Xingqiu, Yelan, Fischl, Fox, Spy, Autoron, Fischl, Scientist, Lady Farina, Kukishinobu, Edgelord. You get the idea. Next up, we have Aggravate teams. She's an excellent final slot here, thanks to the usual qualities she provides, that being EM share and 4VV. Just note that if you're playing Sucrose in a Nihida Aggravate team, you should swirl Electro first so that the Dendro application doesn't eat up the Electro application too fast. She's especially nice in Yai teams, firstly because you get 2 Fox ladies in one team, and secondly because Yai has split scaling with EM, so she appreciates Sucrose's EM share a lot. Example teams include Clorox Bleach, Fischl, Baiju, Sucrose, Pink Fox, Fischl, Nihida, Green Fox, Kaching, Fischl, Kirara, Scientist. National teams are as old as time, and the classic national team is something that Sucrose can drive wonderfully. Xiangling really appreciates the EM share, and Sucrose is able to constantly swirl on field when she does normal attacks due to being an Animo catalyst. A team that has certainly proved its worth over the years for sure. Example teams include Sucrose, Bennett, Xiangling, Xingqiu, Green Fox, Bennett, Leo Chef, Yelan or Lady Farina. You get the drill. Vape teams are naturally very partial to her because they scale very hard off of EM, and because Sucrose provides so much of that, she's very preferable here. Excellent for forming some free-to-play friendly setups if you find yourself needing an Animo slot-in to provide you a 4VV. Example teams include Fauver, Xingqiu, Bennett, Sucrose. The same applies to melt teams. The recent release of Crazy Granny Itzley has led to melt teams absolutely dominating the Genshin meta, and what do you know? Both the Insane Grandmother and melt teams in general scale very hard off of EM, so that's another potential avenue that you could take. Example teams include Everlasting as the Moon, Sitlolly, Bennett, and Scientific Element. Moika, Sitlolly, Boken to Boken, Science Woman. Don't worry about fighting spirits being an issue, as Sitlolly will cover for most of the required Night Soul consumption. Not all of it, but most of it. Keep that in mind. Then, there is also her function as being a general 4VV slot-in for any team that can utilize it. 4VV is one of the most universally applicable sets in the game, with many teams being able to take advantage of its buffs. In these cases, you can play the character pretty much anywhere and yield some value out of her, even if you don't particularly need her EM share in that team-specific case. If you have a more specific Sucrose setup that you'd like to use, comment down below, and I'll tell you whether the team is going to work or not. There's also her ancient use as a Xiao battery. As with her C1, she can generate a lot of animal particles for him. I mean, yes, this works, but budget Xiao teams are pretty weak in general, so I wouldn't opt to play him if you don't have his best installed teammates. Favonia's Farazan should generally be enough to cover you. In the case that it isn't, you can either opt for Sac Frags on Sucrose for another skill cast, or R5 TDDS to give him 48% attack. 4VV isn't wasted if you have Lady Farina in the team, as you'll be boosting her personal damage. However, because Sucrose's skill cast is pretty slow, she can occasionally absorb some of the particles herself, and if you don't have an elemental sub-DPS in the team, then Sucrose's 4VV is wasted. I generally never like recommending budget Xiao, because he's an extremely resource-intensive hypercarry. So while sure, you can use this, just know that there's better options over her these days. But I know that he did recently have a rerun on the Chronicled Wish, so there's most likely a few of you who might not have his best options. Example teams include Xiao, Farazan, TDDS Sucrose, Xianyun, Lament, Farina, Sucrose, Bennett, Evil Conquering, Bennett, Shangling, Sucrose. You get the idea. And how does this green fox work? Well, her normal attacks will deal 4 simple Animo strikes. Nothing much else to add here. As for her skill, she'll launch off an Animo field which groups up enemies and does a bit of swirl damage. That's all there is to it. 1.0 kits are literally shorter than Ocean-Hued Clam's entire artifact description, man. Her burst launches out an Animo butterfly that will periodically proc Animo damage. It can absorb one element that it comes into contact with. However, it's extremely unstable at doing so. You're very unlikely to land this absorption consistently, so I wouldn't rely on it by any means. It can also group, but generally, the procs of the Animo butterfly will push enemies away from its radius as opposed to sucking them in. It's much better to rely on her skill for consistent grouping, as her burst is more likely to ungroup enemies. Sadly, not a very good burst. An incredibly simple kit to understand on the whole. As for her Ascension passives, simple. Sucrose's A1 will give every teammate 50 EM, regardless of how much EM she has herself, whenever she triggers a swirl reaction. That's all there is to it. Very simple and effective A1. It'll get the job done for you just fine. Her A4 is what triggers a 20% EM share. She procs it even whenever her skill or burst hits an enemy, and it lasts 8 seconds. If you play her as a driver, you'll have infinite uptime on this. Otherwise, in teams like Aggravate, she can usually swap back on pretty quickly to refresh the uptime of this buff. Extremely valuable A4. Paired with her A1, you'd be providing characters with up to 250 EM if your Sucrose was to have 1000 EM built on her. Lovely stuff. As for her talent priorities, simple. Don't go for any of them. If you care about Sucrose's personal damage, then level her up, as swirls scale very heavily with level. Then make sure to dump her with plenty of EM. There is literally no reason to waste resources on her talents, because all they do is increase her scalings. Her swirl damage has nothing to do with her scalings. So save yourself the hassle and don't bother with them. Science equipment is expensive, so if you want to donate to your research, let's talk Constellations. She gains another skill charge. More swirls, which equals more damage. Cool and self-explanatory, nothing much else to add here. This doesn't matter, because extra time on her dysfunctional burst is irrelevant. You won't be casting it 99% of the time anyway, unless you have a very specific reason for doing so. Upgrades to your talent scalings are very redundant, so no need to focus on the C3 all that much. Cool to have it though. This C4 is mostly useful for on-field driver Sucrose, as you get in more skills per rotation, which equals more swirls. So for that purpose, it's a cool C4, but for an off-field support Sucrose, you have no reason to particularly care about this. Once again, this constellation is negligible, especially because it caters towards her irrelevant burst. On paper, this C6 would be amazing. 20% damage bonus sounds insanely good, but unfortunately, they tied this to your dysfunctional burst, so you're rarely ever going to be able to reap the rewards of this constellation. On the bright side, this makes her a very free-to-play friendly unit, as she requires next to zero resources to build effectively and works right out of the box at C0. In terms of high Primogem-based investment, brother, it's Sucrose. If you're playing this character, it's because you're trying to save Primogems. But if you happen to be a huge fan of her, then you can consider Mizuki's weapon for her personal damage. Otherwise, just use R5 TDDS, it will be best as slot in 99% of her teams, and sac frags will serve just fine in her driver-based setups. While I don't praise Sucrose as highly as most people, I do still think she's a decent unit that can get the job done for you pretty well. She's free-to-play friendly, highly accessible, and I'd say it's fair to call her a pretty cute unit. Felt like seeing as she shares a lot of similar qualities with some other units, a guide on Sucrose may be useful. Certainly let me know about what you think of Sucrose down below. Do you still use her these days? I'd love to hear your thoughts. As always, I have a ZZZ second channel. Head on over and subscribe if you're interested in some fun, silly ZZZ content. I'd also like to mention that I stream on Twitch. I stream once a week every week on Saturdays, starting from 3 PM UK time. Come along so that we can play Wuthering Waves, ZZ, and do some other fun stuff together. Hopefully this video was able to get your Sucrose blasting your enemies to bits through scientific means. This has been Juice, signing out, and perhaps we do a little bit of trolling.